What happens when privilege collides with justice? When someone who has never faced consequences is forced to confront the reality of their actions. Today, we bring you the powerful and emotional journey of Camille Sinclair, a wealthy socialite who thought she was untouchable until the world decided otherwise. This is more than just a story about punishment. It's about redemption, growth, and the hard lessons that come when arrogance meets accountability. Will Camille learn before it's too late? Watch until the very end to find out. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you love stories that challenge, inspire, and transform, hit that subscribe button for more inspiring stories told. Charleston's Superior Courtroom 3B was overflowing, buzzing with an energy that felt palpable, almost electric. Rows of wooden benches were packed with journalists, activists, and city officials, their murmurs blending into a tense hum. Camera crews lined the back wall, their lenses trained on the defendant's table, ready to capture every smirk, every eye roll, every ounce of arrogance they expected from Camille Sinclair. Everyone in Charleston knew the Sinclair name. It carried power, privilege, and influence, a name that had never known consequences. Camille was the spoiled daughter of Senator Robert Sinclair, whose wealth and political connections had shielded her from every scandal, every reckless mistake. But today, the city wanted blood. Then, like an actress making her grand entrance, Camille Sinclair strolled in, 20 minutes late. The doors swung open, and she sauntered inside, draped in a crimson designer suit, oversized sunglasses covering half her face. Her stiletto heels clicked loudly against the marble floor, each step slow, deliberate, as if this courtroom was just another red carpet event. The tension in the room deepened as she ignored the judge, the attorneys, even the court staff, her fingers tapping rapidly on her phone. The gallery exchanged knowing glances. No remorse, no fear, just privilege, wrapped in arrogance. Her lawyer, Benjamin Carter, walked quickly behind her, his expression tight, his forehead slick with nervous sweat. He had begged her to take this hearing seriously, but Camille hadn't listened. She never listened. Why should she? She had never faced consequences before. She finally slid into her chair, tossing her Chanel handbag onto the table as if she were claiming territory. Then, with a smirk, she leaned back in her seat and crossed her legs, completely unimpressed by the spectacle unfolding around her. The courtroom doors slammed shut. A hush fell over the room as Judge Malcolm Grayson stepped in, a towering figure in his black robe, his piercing eyes scanning the courtroom with quiet authority. He had the presence of a man who had seen too many entitled defendants, too many privileged people who believed the law was optional. He wasn't one to be rattled, and today he looked prepared for war. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Everyone stood immediately, except Camille. She sighed, dramatically, before finally pushing herself up with all the grace of someone deeply inconvenienced. The tension in the room thickened. Judge Grayson said nothing, but the way he eyed Camille like a predator sizing up its prey was enough to send chills down the backs of those who had seen him work before. Once seated, he wasted no time. "Let's begin." His deep voice echoed through the courtroom as he adjusted his glasses and flipped open the thick case file before him. The energy shifted. Suddenly, it was no longer a performance for the media. This was real. This was happening. "Miss Sinclair, you stand before this court today on charges of reckless endangerment, destruction of public property, and felony hit and run. Do you understand these charges?" Camille barely glanced up. "Sure." A murmur rippled through the room. Even her lawyer tensed, his hands gripping his briefcase like a lifeline. Judge Grayson lifted an eyebrow, his fingers steepling together on the bench. "Miss Sinclair, let me make something very clear. This is a court of law. You will show respect, or I will have you removed." Camille rolled her eyes so hard the movement was almost theatrical. "Respect. Got it." Judge Grayson didn't flinch. Instead, he continued reading from the case file, his voice slow, deliberate, like a man laying down bricks for the gallows. "On the night of June 17th, you were seen speeding through downtown Charleston, under the influence, ignoring multiple traffic signals, and finally, almost striking a pedestrian in a crosswalk. That pedestrian, Luis Herrera, a 66-year-old disabled war veteran, was forced to dive out of the way, resulting in a severe injury to his wrist and a concussion. You did not stop. You did not call for help. You drove away. Camille exhaled loudly, shifting in her seat like a bored teenager. You say that like I hit him, she scoffed. He was fine. He moved. Judge Grayson set the case file down, his expression unreadable. He reached for his glasses, removed them slowly, and folded them neatly on the bench. The air in the room changed. Miss Sinclair, he said, his voice heavy with controlled authority. Your arrogance is astounding. But today, you are going to learn what justice truly means. A deep silence followed, the kind that pulled the air from the room. Camille blinked, unimpressed, then turned toward her best friend, Rachel Dawson, who sat in the gallery, snapping pictures on her phone. She giggled under her breath, whispering, "This is ridiculous." Then, the moment that changed everything. The side door of the courtroom opened. A wheelchair rolled inside, pushed carefully by a medical assistant. The moment Luis Herrera entered, the room's atmosphere turned suffocatingly heavy. His left arm was secured in a sling, and deep purple bruises lined his face, a stark contrast against his aged, weathered skin. And yet, his eyes were kind, filled with an unshakable dignity that made Camille's indifference even uglier. The courtroom gasped collectively. Even some of Camille's supporters shifted uncomfortably. And then, the moment that would be played over and over on the news that evening, Camille Sinclair laughed. Not loud, not exaggerated, just a small, dismissive chuckle, as if the entire situation was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Oh, please," she murmured under her breath, shaking her head. "This is just for show. He looks fine to me." A wave of shock ripped through the room. Journalists clutched their pens tighter, activists whispered furiously, and even Benjamin Carter, her own lawyer, looked at Camille like she had just dug her own grave. Then, the real moment of reckoning. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his expression hard as steel, his voice low, steady, dangerous. "Miss Sinclair," he said, his words slicing through the silence like a blade. "You are digging your own grave." For the first time, Camille faltered. It was only a flicker, a small, involuntary shift in her posture, but it was enough. Judge Grayson had her now, and the entire world was watching. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Judge Malcolm Grayson's words hung in the air like a loaded gun, pointed directly at Camille Sinclair. "You are digging your own grave." For the first time, Camille felt something foreign slither into her chest, unease. It was faint, buried beneath years of entitlement and invincibility, but it was there. A flicker of doubt. A crack in the perfectly curated armor of privilege she had worn all her life. But then, her old instincts kicked in. She smirked, flipping her hair over her shoulder, and let out a slow, deliberate chuckle, a move designed to make everyone else feel ridiculous for taking this so seriously. "Oh, come on," she scoffed, leaning back lazily in her chair. "This whole thing is a joke." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Her lawyer, Benjamin Carter, buried his face in his hands, and even the bailiff stiffened, as if bracing for the explosion they all saw coming. Judge Grayson simply exhaled, slow and controlled. His patience had reached its expiration date. He picked up a document and began reading her fate aloud. "Miss Sinclair, you have displayed a blatant disregard for the law, for common decency, and for human life. Your actions have endangered others, and your behavior in this courtroom has only confirmed what many already suspected. You believe yourself to be untouchable. That ends today." The murmurs grew louder. A few journalists at the back were furiously typing on their laptops. Camille rolled her eyes again, arms crossed over her chest. Judge Grayson lifted his chin slightly, his sharp gaze cutting through her like a scalpel. Then, with absolute finality, he delivered the sentence. "You are hereby sentenced to 6 months of full-time community service at the Charleston Rehabilitation Shelter." You will work under the supervision of shelter staff, and your progress will be reported weekly to this court. A few gasps sounded from the audience. A rehabilitation shelter? That was not what anyone had expected. Camille scoffed, shaking her head, as if he had just suggested she clean sewer drains. But Judge Grayson wasn't finished. Microphones were shoved in front of cameras, headlines updated in real time. Breaking: Camille Sinclair sentenced to 6 months of community service after shocking courtroom display. Then came the protests. By the time Camille's car pulled up to the Sinclair family estate, a mob of angry Charleston residents had gathered at the gates, holding signs and chanting, "Justice for Louise. Privilege is not a get-out-of jail card. Sinclair money won't save her now." Camille stared out the tinted window, her mouth slightly open. The reality of the situation was sinking in. She pulled out her phone, opening social media. It was worse than she thought. Her name was trending nationally, but not in the way she liked. Sinclair privilege. Lock her up. Justice for Louise. She scrolled through dozens of videos of herself rolling her eyes in court, of her laughing when Luis Herrera appeared in a wheelchair. There were clips of Judge Grayson's sentencing, people cheering for his decision. Her fingertips turned numb. She needed a distraction. She opened her group chat with Rachel Dawson. "Camille, can you believe this? These people are insane. My father is going to handle it." Rachel's reply came instantly. "Rachel, oh babe, have you seen the video?" Camille frowned, typing quickly. "Camille, what video?" "Rachel, check Twitter." Heart pounding, she switched apps. It was the first thing at the top of her feed. A video, posted by a local news station. It had over 5 million views. She pressed play. It was her. From 2 nights before the trial. A leaked recording. She was at a private party, drink in hand, surrounded by her usual clique. Someone was filming on their phone, hidden. In the video, she was mocking Luis Herrera. "I mean, did you see the way he jumped out of the way?" She laughed, mimicking an exaggerated stumble. "Like, come on, Grandpa. I wasn't even close to hitting you. Chill out." The people around her laughed. Rachel Dawson laughed. Camille felt sick. She scrolled down. The video was posted by Rachel herself, her own best friend. Her phone rang. It was her father. She answered instantly. "Dad, you're on your own, Camille." She froze. "What?" Her father's voice was cold, calculated, distant. "I can't be associated with this any longer. Do not call me again." And then he hung up. She sat there, staring at the black screen of her phone, her breath shallow. Her father had cut her off. Her best friend had betrayed her. Her career was destroyed. Her money couldn't fix this. For the first time in her life, Camille Sinclair had no power. The realization hit her like a brick to the chest. She was alone. And tomorrow morning, she would walk into a world she had spent her entire life ignoring. A world where privilege meant nothing. And there would be no escape. What do you think about Camille's downfall? Do you believe she deserves this harsh reality check, or is the punishment too extreme? Let us know in the comments below. Watching her go from untouchable privilege to total abandonment is intense. But is this the lesson she truly needs to change? If you're rooting for Camille to learn and redeem herself, hit the like button and show your support. Her journey is far from over, and the real challenge begins now. Stay tuned for the next part, where Camille faces a world she's spent her entire life ignoring. Don't miss it. The morning air was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to the skin and made everything feel damp. Camille Sinclair sat stiffly in the back seat of a rusted-out transport van, staring out the grimy window as the city around her shifted. The towering skyscrapers and cobblestone streets of Charleston's wealthy districts faded away, replaced by dilapidated buildings, graffiti-covered walls, and cracked sidewalks. She wrinkled her nose. This couldn't be real, but it was. Her designer bag dug into her lap, the only piece of her old world she had left. The thought of spending 6 months in a place like this was unbelievable, and yet, there she was, being driven straight into the belly of poverty, stripped of privilege, abandoned by everyone she once relied on. The van lurched to a stop, and the driver barely glanced at her as he reached over and yanked open the door. End of the line, princess. Camille clenched her jaw and stepped out, her heels clicking against the uneven pavement. The building in front of her was worse than she imagined. A faded brick structure with bars on the windows, the paint on the door chipped and peeling. The sign overhead read, Charleston Rehabilitation Shelter. She exhaled sharply, already regretting every decision that had led her here. Before she could turn back, the door swung open. A tall, broad-shouldered black woman stood in the doorway, arms crossed over her chest. Her gaze was sharp, unreadable, like she had already assessed every ounce of Camille's entitlement and found it unimpressive. Aisha Monroe, the shelter supervisor. The woman Judge Grayson had warned Camille about. Aisha took a single step forward, the movement small but commanding. You must be Sinclair, she said, her tone flat. You're late. Camille blinked, offended. I wasn't given a schedule, she snapped. Aisha didn't flinch. You don't get one. You show up when we say, and you leave when we say. Camille's stomach tightened. She had assumed she would be able to come and go as she pleased, maybe sneak away early when she got bored. But the way Aisha said it made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Camille exhaled sharply, trying to mask her discomfort with a forced smirk. Well, she said, looking around the place with thinly veiled disgust, let's get this over with. Aisha's lips twitched, but it wasn't amusement. It was the kind of smirk people gave when they knew something you didn't. You're gonna love it here, she said smoothly. Then she turned and walked back inside. Camille hesitated, staring at the dimly lit hallway beyond. The air smelled like bleach, old wood, and something faintly metallic, not quite blood, but not far from it either. She swallowed hard before finally stepping inside. The door slammed shut behind her, sealing her inside a world she had never known. Camille followed Aisha down the hall, past rows of small, cramped rooms where people in mismatched clothing sat on worn-out cots, some staring blankly at the walls, others murmuring softly amongst themselves. Her heels echoed with every step, too loud, too out of place. Finally, Aisha stopped in front of a janitor's closet and pulled out a bucket, a mop, and a pair of rubber gloves. Camille frowned. What is this? She asked. Aisha lifted an eyebrow. Your first task, she said, handing her the bucket. The bathrooms. Camille let out a short, disbelieving laugh. You're joking. Aisha didn't blink. Nope. Camille's face twisted in disgust. I don't clean bathrooms. Aisha tilted her head, folding her arms. Then you don't leave. Camille's breath hitched. She turned toward the front doors, half expecting to see them still open, the street still waiting for her. But they weren't. Instead, there was a security guard standing by the entrance, arms crossed, gaze steady. She looked back at Aisha, realization hitting like a freight train. She was trapped. Her fingers tightened around the mop handle, her nails digging into her palm. Then, through clenched teeth, she muttered, Fine. And she stalked off toward the bathrooms, bucket in hand. The bathroom smelled like mildew and cheap disinfectant. The stalls were old, the walls covered in faded graffiti, and the sinks were stained yellow from years of overuse. Camille gagged. This was beneath her. But as she rolled up her sleeves and dipped the mop into the bucket, she felt a pair of eyes watching her. She glanced over her shoulder. A woman sat on the edge of the sink, arms folded. She had deep lines on her face, tired eyes, and a half-smoked cigarette dangling from her fingers. She was grinning. Princess doesn't look so fancy now, the woman mused, blowing out a curl of smoke. Camille ignored her, forcing herself to focus on the mop. The woman's grin widened. Camille had managed to slip away, scrubbing furiously at her ruined shirt in the laundry room when a commotion erupted at the front of the shelter. She frowned, straining to listen, and then she heard the words that made her blood run cold. Maria Herrera, Channel 6 News, reporting live from Charleston Rehabilitation Shelter. Camille's entire body went rigid. Luis Herrera's daughter. A journalist. And she was here. With a news crew. Her heart pounded violently as she crept toward the entrance. Through the crack in the door, she saw Maria standing in front of a cameraman, her expression unreadable but sharp. Today, we begin documenting Camille Sinclair's court-ordered rehabilitation sentence, Maria announced, her voice strong, steady, ruthless. The privileged socialite who once laughed at my father's injuries will now work among the very people she once mocked. And the world will be watching. The camera panned to the inside of the shelter. Someone spotted Camille in the hallway. There she is, someone whispered. Camille took a step back, pulse racing. Aisha Monroe smirked from the side of the room. Smile, princess, she said, crossing her arms. You're about to be famous all over again. And just like that, the world knew where she was. And there was nowhere left to hide. The moment Maria Herrera's news crew broadcast Camille's humiliation to the world, something inside her snapped. The shelter's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glow over the dingy hallway where Camille stood frozen in place. She could hear the whispers around her, the snickers, the way the shelter workers exchanged knowing looks. She really thought she was untouchable. Bet she never scrubbed a floor in her life. She ain't nothing without her daddy's money. Camille's fingernails dug into her palms, her face burning with embarrassment. Humiliated, exhausted, angry. That was the only word that could describe what she felt. Pure, unfiltered rage. And she needed somewhere to put it. She stormed into the kitchen, her body tight with fury, and threw the dirty mop into the corner with a loud smack. Aisha Monroe was standing by the sink, arms crossed, watching her like she had been expecting this meltdown all along. Camille's hands trembled with frustration as she pointed a shaking finger at Aisha. This is your fault, she spat. You let those people humiliate me. You just stood there and let it happen. Aisha let out a slow breath, as if she had been waiting for Camille to explode. Then, in the calmest tone imaginable, she said, No, Camille, you did this to yourself. The words hit harder than Camille expected. She clenched her jaw. I don't belong here. I'm not like you people. Aisha's eyes darkened instantly. A thick silence filled the room, and the few workers still cleaning up stiffened. Camille felt the shift, but she was too wrapped up in her own anger to stop. You've spent your life believing people like us don't matter, Aisha said, her voice deadly quiet. Camille froze. Aisha took a slow step forward, and suddenly, the kitchen felt a whole lot smaller. But let me tell you something, princess, Aisha continued, her words razor-sharp, cutting through Camille's pride like glass. You are nothing without your privilege. Nothing. Now, let's see what you're really made of. Camille felt something ugly rise in her throat, shame, anger, frustration, but she swallowed it down and did the only thing she knew how to do. She lashed out. I'm done, she hissed, ripping off her gloves and throwing them on the counter. Aisha didn't react. Camille took a step back, her chest heaving, eyes burning with humiliated fury. I'm not going to let some pathetic shelter worker talk to me like this, she snarled. I quit. She turned on her heel and stormed toward the exit. Aisha didn't stop her. No one did. And for the first time in her life, Camille Sinclair was walking away from something she couldn't control. Camille burst through the front doors of the shelter, expecting the cool night air to bring her relief. It didn't. The streets were still swarming with reporters, their cameras flashing as they spotted her. Camille, are you leaving the program? Does this mean you're refusing your sentence? Are you prepared for the legal consequences? Camille shoved past them, her pulse roaring in her ears, and climbed into the first taxi she could find. Where to? The driver asked. Home. That was the obvious answer. But for the first time, she wasn't sure where that was. Her father had abandoned her. Her so-called friends had sold her out. And now, she had walked away from the only thing keeping her out of prison. Her phone buzzed violently in her lap. She grabbed it with shaky fingers, her heart pounding as she saw the notification. Breaking news. Judge Grayson issues statement on Camille Sinclair's failure to complete sentencing. Camille's stomach dropped. She clicked the video, and there he was, Judge Malcolm Grayson, his voice cold, his expression unreadable. Miss Sinclair has made it clear that she believes she is above the law. Let me be very clear, she is not. The camera zoomed in, his next words landing like thunderclaps in Camille's ears. If she fails to return to the shelter within 24 hours, I will personally ensure that she is taken into custody. And this time, there will be no special treatment. The video ended, but Camille could still hear the sound of her world crashing down around her. She was out of options, and for the first time in her life, she was truly afraid. The next morning, Camille sat curled up in the back of the taxi, her head against the window, watching the world pass by in a daze. Her hands gripped her phone tightly, as if holding onto it would somehow keep her world from slipping through her fingers. But it already had. Her father had cut her off. Her bank accounts were frozen. She had nowhere to go. And now, prison was a very real possibility. The taxi driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "You all right, kid?" Camille's throat tightened. She couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to her without hidden motives. She didn't answer. The driver shrugged, then nodded toward the city streets outside. "You see them folks?" he said. Camille looked up. They were passing a homeless encampment, rows of tents lined up on the sidewalk, people huddled together for warmth. A month ago, Camille wouldn't have given them a second glance. But now, she felt a cold, creeping realization settle in her chest. That could be me. The thought sent a violent shudder through her body. She had nothing left. And for the first time since this nightmare started, Camille Sinclair cried. Real, body-racking sobs, the kind she had spent years suppressing. The driver didn't say a word. But when he pulled up in front of the Charleston Rehabilitation Shelter, he simply put the car in park and said, "Looks like you got a choice to make." Camille stared at the shelter's front doors, her hands trembling. Inside was humiliation, exhaustion, suffering. But outside was prison. There was no way out. With a deep, shaky breath, Camille opened the door and stepped out. The moment she stepped inside, the entire shelter fell silent. Aisha Monroe was waiting in the hallway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Camille's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to lift her chin, to meet Aisha's stare without flinching. "I'm back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Aisha tilted her head, studying her. Then, after a long, painful pause, she said, "Good." And just like that, Camille wasn't a Sinclair anymore. She was just another broken soul in need of redemption. And the hardest part of her journey was only beginning. The days at the Charleston Rehabilitation Shelter dragged on, but something inside Camille Sinclair had changed. She wasn't the same girl who had laughed in a courtroom. She wasn't the same girl who had walked out of the shelter in defiance. She wasn't the same girl who had believed she was untouchable. Humility had a way of breaking a person down before building them back up, and Camille had been shattered. At first, she moved through her tasks silently, eyes down, doing the bare minimum just to survive. She scrubbed floors, washed dishes, served food, things she had never done in her privileged life. She thought no one noticed, but they did. It was Aisha Monroe who saw it first. One evening, as Camille finished cleaning a row of folding tables, Aisha approached her, arms crossed, her sharp eyes studying Camille's posture. "You're different," Aisha finally said. Camille hesitated, wiping sweat from her forehead. "I don't know what I am anymore," she admitted. Aisha nodded. "Good. That means you're finally seeing yourself." Camille didn't know what that meant, but for the first time, she wanted to find out. As the weeks passed, Camille started listening. She had spent her entire life believing poverty was a choice, that people who ended up in places like this had simply made bad decisions. Now she saw the truth. There was Elaine, a mother of two who had been evicted overnight after her landlord illegally raised her rent. There was Tasha, a former teacher whose medical debt had destroyed her life. There was Renee, who had escaped an abusive marriage with nothing but the clothes on her back. These weren't lazy people. They weren't failures. They were forgotten. And Camille had once been the kind of person who forgot them. One night, as she sat in the break room, staring blankly at her hands, Aisha sat across from her. "You're thinking too hard," Aisha said. Camille let out a dry laugh. "That's all I do these days." Aisha leaned forward, her tone softer than Camille had ever heard it. So what are you going to do about it? Camille swallowed hard. She didn't have an answer. Not yet. 1 month later, Camille Sinclair stood in front of the world again, but this time it was different. The press had gathered outside the shelter, cameras flashing, news stations streaming live. But Camille wasn't here to fight back, to deny, to defend herself. She was here to own it. She took a deep breath, the microphone in her trembling hands. She had practiced the words, but now they felt too small. I was wrong, she said, her voice raw, stripped of arrogance. I didn't just break the law. I broke something much worse. I broke trust. I laughed in the face of a man who had every right to hate me, and I walked through life believing that my last name meant I could do whatever I wanted. She glanced at the crowd, her heart pounding. No one looked convinced yet. So she spoke from the place she had kept locked away for years, the truth. I was raised in privilege, she admitted. I never had to think about how other people lived. I thought money protected me from consequences. But it doesn't. It never did. The cameras zoomed in. She could hear the quiet murmurs among the journalists. I can't undo what I've done, she continued, her voice thick. But I can change. I can learn. She turned toward the man sitting in the front row, his arm still in a sling, Luis Herrera. She met his gaze, and for the first time in her life, she truly meant what she said next. Mr. Herrera, I am so sorry. The world held its breath. Luis Herrera studied her for a long, painful moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. I just wanted her to learn, he said into the microphone. His voice was calm, steady. Because when we stop learning, we stop growing. The weight in Camille's chest cracked open. For the first time, forgiveness didn't feel like something she deserved, but something she had been given anyway. That evening, Judge Malcolm Grayson appeared on live television, addressing the city of Charleston. Camille sat inside the shelter, watching the broadcast with the rest of the residents. Judge Grayson looked directly into the camera, his expression unreadable. Camille Sinclair's punishment is over, he said. She has served her sentence. She has made her public apology. But the real test begins now. Camille swallowed hard. Miss Sinclair, he continued, you have spent your life in privilege. The question is, what will you do with it now? A hush fell over the room. Aisha glanced at Camille, her arms crossed. Well, she said, what are you going to do? Camille took a breath. Then, for the first time in her life, she had an answer. She was going to be better. And this time, she meant it. Life has a way of breaking us down before it builds us back up, and Camille Sinclair's journey is proof that even the most privileged, the most blind to the struggles of others, can change. But change is never easy. It is painful. It requires loss, humility, and a willingness to face the truth about who we are. Camille was forced to confront her worst self, stripped of the wealth and power that once protected her from consequences. For the first time, she had to look in the mirror and see not the daughter of a powerful senator, not a socialite dripping in luxury, but a woman who had hurt others and had to make it right. But here's the real question. What will we do when we are faced with our own reflection? Camille's story isn't just about one woman's downfall. It's about the way privilege can blind us, the way arrogance can push us to believe we are untouchable, and the way the world has a way of humbling us when we least expect it. Many people never get the chance to redeem themselves. Many people live their entire lives ignoring those who struggle, walking past the suffering of others, believing it's someone else's problem. But today, let's make a different choice. Let's learn from Camille's mistakes without having to live them. What if we took a moment every day to step into someone else's shoes? What if we stopped assuming that we are where we are simply because we worked harder or were smarter? What if we recognize that not everyone gets a second chance, so when we do, we better make it count? Luis Herrera's words in the courtroom still linger. When we stop learning, we stop growing. That is the heart of this story. Growth comes from struggle. Wisdom comes from pain. Redemption comes from facing the truth, no matter how much it hurts. Camille had to hit rock bottom to finally understand the weight of her actions. But you don't have to. You don't have to lose everything to learn the value of humility, empathy, and kindness. You don't have to be sentenced to a shelter to understand that everyone deserves dignity, no matter their circumstances. You can choose to grow, to learn, to see the world through the eyes of those who have struggled in ways you never will. And if Camille could do it, if she could take her worst mistakes and turn them into a lesson, then so can you. So now, we turn the question over to you. What will you do with your privilege, your knowledge, your second chances? Will you be like the Camille of the past? Or will you be like the Camille of today, someone who chooses to be better? If you believe in redemption, if you believe that people can change, if you believe that no one is beyond learning, then hit the like button to support Camille's journey. Let's show the world that growth is possible, that second chances matter, that justice isn't about punishment, it's about transformation. And this is just the beginning. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories that challenge perspectives, that push us to think deeper, that make us ask the hard questions. Because life is about learning, and when we stop learning, we stop growing. So, are you ready to grow with us? Hit subscribe, and let's take this journey together.